the largest policy win for the banking industry since the 2008 global financial meltdown. Isn't it funny? Win for the banking industry and global financial meltdown in the same sentence. After the Great Recession, which caused millions of jobs and destroyed countless lives, our government put regulations in place to make sure it never happened again. Now Trump is getting rid of those rules? What could possibly go wrong? Back in 1990, I forget the year, I think it was 6, it might have been 1999, Phil Gramm, a Republican senator, Phil Gramm was, considered kind of a banking wonk. He was on the banking committee. He was, he claimed knowledge of all things banking, but he was a Republican, so he was into deregulation. And he looked back at GlassSteagall, which was passed in 1935, as I recall, which basically said investment banks and checkbook banks, what are called commercial banks, banks where you have checking and savings accounts, may not be the same thing. You may not take a person who has put money in your bank, you may not take that money and then gamble it in the marketplace, basically. And so, if you want to put your money in a bank that gambles in the marketplace, go with an investment bank, Fidelity or Charles Schwab or something. If you want to go with a bank that, or Goldman Sachs or whatever, you want to go with a bank that does banking, checking accounts, savings accounts, go with, Wells Fargo or your local bank or whatever it may be, Bank of America, Chase. Well, Phil Gramm argued it before Congress, and I thought this was hysterical at the time. A lot of us were just ridiculing it. But Phil Gramm basically said, this works so well that the last time we had a run on the banks was 1933. I mean, we haven't had a run on the banks since then. So we don't need this anymore. So Congress, in all their brilliant wisdom, or at least the Republicans in Congress, got together and basically deregulated the banks. Said, sure, you can go back into you can go back into gambling if you want. And of course, a lot of the banks went into real estate gambling, and in 2008, that market, got the plug pulled on it. And George W. Bush was president, and you'll remember the Secretary of the Treasury coming out, with his hands trembling as he was reading the one. I have a one-page thing that I want to send to Congress to beg them for trillions of dollars to give to the banksters. And of course, that's what they did. I mean, they didn't, people like, Steve Mnuchin, the foreclosure king, had apparently robo-signed some 30,000 mortgage eviction notices. I mean, just kicking people out of their homes who couldn't make their payments on these so-called liar loans that had come about as the result of the deregulation. And the liar loans had been aggregated and sold, as bundles, as bundles that were a new investment vehicle, right? New investment opportunities, and that the banks were buying into, and it crashed the whole system. It was a disaster. So what did we do in 2009 when President Obama came into office? He re-regulated the banks. He said, we're going to go back, not quite as vigorously as prior to the 1990s, but made some substantial regulations on the banks. The main one being what are called reserve requirements. Reserve requirements are how much money a bank has to keep in cash just in case a whole bunch of people decide that they want their money all at once as the result of some, big economic event. For example, you go into a serious recession. In 2008, of course, it was a housing crisis, but you go into a serious recession, a lot of people lose their jobs, and because they've lost their jobs, they still need to make their mortgage payments, they still need to make their credit card payments, but they don't have the money, and so they just basically go to the bank and say, I need all my money out of my savings account right now, and I'll even take the penalty on cashing in my CDs. And at that point, the bank, looks around and says, well, we don't have all that money. Sorry. And then you've got a real disaster. And that's, to some extent, that's what happened in 2008. That's certainly what happened in the late 1920s, early 1930s. And In fact, the month before Franklin Roosevelt took office, which would have been February of 1933, the last banks in America failed. I mean, by the time by the first week of his presidency, there was not a functioning bank left in America, or very, very small handful of them, and they were very small and local. So anyhow, we raised the capital requirements, the reserve requirements on the banks, and said, you're going to have to keep a little more cash in the bank for these kind of runs on the bank, so that if this sort of thing happens again, we're not going to end up with Hank Paulson or his modern-day equivalent. He was Bush's Treasury Secretary. You're not going to, end up with this guy, standing before a podium, with his hands trembling on a piece of paper begging Congress for trillions of dollars. So that's kind of the backstory. And here we are now, according to Politico's Michael Stratford. The second Trump administration is, quote, gearing up to deliver a major win to Wall Street banks by easing rules imposed on mega banks in response to the 2008 financial crisis. Yeah. Stratford reports in Politico, quote, Trump-appointed regulators are nearing completion of a proposal that would relax rules on how much of a capital cushion the nation's largest banks must have to absorb potential losses and remain solvent during periods of economic stress. These new standards could be released in the coming months, and they could represent the largest policy win for the banking industry since the 2008 global financial meltdown. Isn't it funny, win for the banking industry and global financial meltdown in the same sentence? Pramila Jayapal tweeted, after the Great Recession, which caused millions of jobs and destroyed countless lives, our government put regulations in place to make sure it never happened again. Now Trump is getting rid of those rules? What could possibly go wrong? Yeah. Yeah, Stephen Hellren, one of the, he's a MAGA critic over on X. He says, what's the worst that can happen? Asking for the people back in 2007. And another X-user, Jarmo Leighton, says, we all remember what happened last time they cut regulations. Yeah.